Good Wednesday evening, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVenoSports.com with our college football Week 7 early look ahead. We'll also take a look back at some of the big upsets and crazy finishes that we saw in Week 6 of the college football season. And to do all of that, we need to bring in the founder of RobVenoSports.com. Rob Veno, how are you this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Rob. How about yourself? I think it's only fair that we open up with a little congratulations to our colleague here, Derek Davis, birth of a baby girl this morning. That gives Derek one boy and one girl, so congratulations to Derek and his wife, Lee.
Absolutely. Congratulations to them. And don't worry, Derek will still have lots of great selections for you all this weekend if you're thinking about getting over to RobVenoSports.com to take a look at those from either Derek, myself, or Rob. They're all there at RobVenoSports.com. Rob, you ready to jump into this a little bit?
Absolutely. It's getting a little interesting now, Rob. It's that time of year.
Yeah, we're at the halfway point of the college season for most teams have played 6 games. Some have still only played 5, but we're right about the halfway point between last weekend and this coming weekend, kind of marks halfway through the season. Let's start with a team who had tremendous luck through the first half of the season and thought they might get another wild break on Saturday against Texas A&M, and that would be Tennessee, trailing by a couple of scores very late in that game. See Texas A&M, what looks like going in for the clincher, fumble the ball out of the end zone, giving the ball back to Tennessee. Tennessee comes down the field and scores, sends it into overtime. The teams trade field goals in the first overtime, and Texas A&M gets it done in the second overtime to seal the deal with a touchdown and then an interception. So Tennessee finally in the loss column. Their luck has run out. And A&M, assuming Bama gets by Tennessee this week, is really that A&M-Bama game could be setting up as the showdown of all showdowns in the SEC West. But we'll get to that when the time comes. First, Rob, your thoughts on Tennessee and A&M and that ending?
Yeah, it was quite the comeback by Tennessee, unfazed by the road and unfazed by the time and score situation. That's a team, Rob, that racked up 684 yards in that game, and for a team whose offensive line has been maligned almost universally throughout the season. Boy, fourth quarter, they ran the football down Texas A&M's throat, and then in catch-up mode at the very end were able to throw it as well. But Alvin Kamara in place of Jalen Hurd, outstanding game for him. For Tennessee, the balance was very, very good. 282 on the ground, 402 through the air. Like I say, 684 for the game. That's a lot of yardage against the John Chavitz defense. Certainly A&M still put some pressure on Dobbs with 4 sacks, but you have to be impressed with Tennessee's resiliency all season long. And I think on the other side of the coin, despite winning both games at home in College Station, perhaps a little something is setting in here with Texas A&M. 2-touchdown lead against UCLA with about 4.5 left in Week 1, and Josh Rosen brings UCLA back to force overtime. And, of course, here it looked like a done deal for Texas A&M, as you pointed out, and they allow Tennessee to come back with multiple scores to tie the game late and go on to overtime. So A&M survives. I guess that's what counts nowadays. But in close games at the end, we'll see how they react. So far, so good for Texas A&M. Kevin Sumlin praised his team for hanging with it and getting the victory in the end. But I'd have to say he can't be too pleased with a team that's giving up 14-plus point leads in the fourth quarter on their home field. They need to close these things out a little better.
Absolutely. I think there's a big difference between being resilient, as Texas A&M has shown they can be, and actually closing out a game. I think you much rather have a team that's has the ability to close out a game late in the fourth quarter versus a team that can be resilient and overcome blowing a fourth quarter lead and still win the game.
Yeah, no, that's a coach's wish right there, Rob. Let's get this thing, let's finish it up. And statistically, A&M was solid all game long, especially on the offensive end. I quoted Tennessee's numbers, but let's not overlook the fact that Texas A&M ran the football at will on Tennessee, 353 rushing yards, over 7 yards a carry, 34 pass attempts, only 1 sack of Trevor Knight. You know, the commentators made one point during that game, Rob, which I think we may see happen in the future. If we don't, it could have a negative effect on Texas A&M. But the point was, why doesn't Trevor Knight run the football a little bit more? And we did see him break loose for a long run at a crucial time in the fourth quarter. It seems to me that he should probably, get to the mesh point and pull it out a little more than he does. It looks like there's open territory for him to run. It's hard to argue with a team that ran for 353 yards and 7-1 a pop, but I do think that added element, Trevor Knight, I keep saying Travis, he was a basketball player for UConn years ago. Trevor Knight needs to probably run the football a little bit more because there seems to be a lot of openings there for him. You're so concerned as a defense with the backs for Texas A&M, Ford and Williams, that in some cases I think that Knight is not accounted for and could help his team out offensively.
Absolutely, and maybe you pick up a few more first downs. I mean, Texas A&M has the ability to score quickly, but sometimes you just don't need that 80-yard play. Sometimes you just need 12, 15 yards, work a little bit of clock at the end of these games, and that's something that I think Texas A&M is going to have to be prepared for if they're fortunate enough to have a lead in the fourth quarter against Alabama in a couple of weeks, and they blow that lead. It's going to be a lot harder for them to be resilient and come back and get a win on the road in that kind of environment. They're going to have to learn how to close out games if they're going to beat Alabama.
Yeah, they might wish that they had Johnny Manziel back for that trip that they're going to take to Tuscaloosa. He obviously was the catalyst to their victory there a few years back, and they're going to need that type of performance when the time comes. But that's a little bit down the road here. For now, you have to like A&M's position. At least they're involved. They're in the conversation. Kevin Sumlin, a guy that was on the hot seat to start the year, now has his team 6-0, 4-0 inside the conference. I don't think they could have asked for a better start. Still half a season left, though. 6 is only the halfway mark, and there's a lot to go. And we know, Rob, that the SEC, it's a gauntlet. It's hard, especially the SEC West. It's hard to get through that division unscathed. So far, so good for A&M, but like you said, there's an Alabama game coming. There's other games coming as well for them, so they need to keep it rolling.
Absolutely. Let's move along to another game that the actual ending wasn't necessarily as dramatic as the A&M Tennessee game, but you got Florida State and Miami. It looks like Miami has scored the game-tying touchdown. They forgot to execute one portion of that, though, kicking the extra point. Florida State blocks it and holds on for a 20-19 win in what had to be a very disappointing loss for the Miami Hurricane program and their new head coach, Mark Richt. It looks like he finally has them in a position to get over that hump of not being able to beat Florida State, and then that happens. What are your thoughts on that ending, and if Miami's going to be able to bounce back in a very huge game this week against UNC, which we'll talk about later in the program?
Yeah, boy, that is disappointing for Miami, Rob. I know there was a lot of focus, a lot of effort placed into that contest. Miami looking to make a name for themselves on the national scene once again. Obviously, they were off to a fantastic start. They had a 10-point lead in that game, 13-3 against Florida State. But we've seen it time and time again out of Florida State. If you want to use the word resilient, boy, they come to mind. Down 2 touchdowns against Ole Miss, but have no fear. Here comes Florida State, and they get themselves a victory. Constantly this season, they've been behind multiple scores and found ways to not only come back to get even, but to come back and in instances win the football game. The one exception to that rule, of course, was the North Carolina game where they lose at the end on a 50-plus yard field goal, 37-35. But for FSU, big win in an improbable fashion. Obviously, you don't expect an extra point to be missed at the end of a game like that. Once the touchdown was scored by Miami. Great throw by Brad Kaya, by the way. Stacey Coley on the receiving end of that. Statistically, when you look at that game, though, I think the biggest disappointment for the Miami Hurricanes is that they could not run the football. 2.2 per carry. It's a team loaded with running backs, and they just couldn't move the football against Florida State. And a Florida State defense that has been rung up by plenty of teams so far this season. I think Miami and the 276 total yards that they put up, that's where the disappointment lies. Maybe you can look at the 407 that they gave up, too, total yardage-wise, and say Miami had played far better defense than that so far this season. It's a difficult loss for this team. But Mark Richt is a veteran coach, and despite the fact, Rob, that, Miami hasn't really been in that type of game for quite a while, I think they probably do bounce back. We've said it time and time again, and we'll talk about it a little bit later as well, that coastal division of the ACC is so wide open and so competitive. You have to win it to get to the ACC title game, and I don't think that Miami's going to sulk over that loss. Again, it's one that got away, but I think with a veteran head coach like Rick, he can teach these kids to move forward. I think they're good enough to win that side, as are 2 or 3 other teams. But as far as them, fading away because of that loss, don't see it happening. Time of possession was a killer for them as well. They're minus 13 minutes almost on the clock in that game. Florida State with Dalvin Cook really heating up the last 3 games, controlled the football and played very well.
Let's move along. I think the sigh of relief you heard coming from some of the Power 5 conferences and commissioners and coaches around the country was pretty loud on Saturday afternoon as Houston gets knocked off by Navy. Houston was over a 2-touchdown favorite in that game, but Navy took it to them, got into an offensive shootout, and Houston did not have enough to keep up at the end, losing 46-40 and effectively ending their chances at a national championship. Their argument would have been marginal at best, given the schedule they had played throughout the year, but they did have the big win against Oklahoma to open the season. They could have kind of hung their hats on a little bit as a reason that they deserved to be in the conversation. Not a factor anymore, and I don't see any other non-Power 5 schools being able to play their way into the college playoffs. I'm guessing you agree with me on that one, Rob?
I would think so. I really would. It's interesting that Houston would have the difficulty that they had with the Navy option attack after facing them last year. This AAC conference has been together for a while. These 2 teams are division mates. So you take a look at what Houston did last year against the Navy run game, and they were real good. Navy only ran for 147 yards in that contest. Not so this year. Navy picks up 306 on the ground, only had to throw the football 5 times the entire game to get that 46-40 win. As potent as the Houston offense was, like you said, they couldn't keep up. Huge win for the Naval Academy. Tough loss for Houston. We'll see how they react. I'd be much more interested to see how Houston reacts to their loss this week.
Yeah, it will be very interesting to see if they bounce back, knowing now that their dream of spoiler is over. I think the game that was probably talked about most over the weekend was a game that never actually got played between Florida and LSU. We talked about it at length on our early look ahead last week that Hurricane Matthew was going to impact games along the Atlantic coast, especially from North Carolina southward in through Florida. The Florida administration said they could not host the game on Saturday. They also said they could not travel to play a road game Saturday. As a result, there was a flat-out cancellation. They did not want to take the risk, for whatever reason, of rescheduling into Sunday like some other schools did. South Carolina, Florida Atlantic moved their games to Sunday. They did not want to do that. And as a result now, there is a big potential issue in the SEC, I think more so in the East than the West. The West is a very challenging schedule, and LSU's probably not going to be in contention for the division, although there is an outside possibility still. You don't ever want to write anybody off when they're not out of it yet, but realistically looking at it, it's probably going to be Alabama or Texas A&M from the West. Over in the East, though, Florida has the loss to Tennessee already. Tennessee got the loss to Texas A&M on Saturday afternoon. If they were to drop another one to Bama and, say, run the table after that, which I think is a realistic possibility, and finish at 6-2, and Florida doesn't lose another SEC game, if they don't make up their game with LSU, they would go to the conference championship. Rob, do you think they're going to be able to get this game made up? There's a couple of scenarios. B, do you think it's even going to be necessary?
Well, I think they'll probably view what happens, Rob, and then make a decision from there. If it looks like it's going to be necessary, I'd be pretty sure they'll find a way to play that game. Florida, like you talked about Tennessee's schedule, and it's favorable. Let's call it the way it is. Tennessee's schedule the rest of the way out, especially where Eastern Division opponents are concerned, is very favorable to the Vols. If teams end up in a tie atop a division, it goes from head-to-head over to divisional record, and Tennessee already owns the tiebreaker against Florida, so there'd have to be a situation where Florida could win this thing outright. Florida's schedule the rest of the way, very, very difficult, starting with this week against Missouri. Quarterback Luke Del Rio is going to be back. He would have been back for the LSU game. But this week he will be back against Missouri, a team which their defensive unit had a meeting this week with new defensive coordinator DeMonte Cross to talk about the style of defense that he has brought to Mizzou. We know last year that Missouri was a fantastic defensive unit, and a huge bulk of the personnel returned this season, and just not the same results. Obviously, Cross coming over, and he'll be converting this team fully to a 3-4 defense. They play a lot of read and react rather than just go after the football, and it's held guys like Charles Harris, their star defensive end, back. So this week, if they are let loose, Florida could be in some danger right away. I think, back to your original point, though, I really do believe that the conference is going to take a look at the next couple of weeks, see how this thing plays out. If it looks like it's going to be a problem and they need to play that game, I'm sure they'll find a way to play it. But for now, I think just on paper, Rob, as we look at it, Tennessee has a pretty good path to a divisional title here. What stands in their way isn't really much inside the division. When you're talking about South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Kentucky, Mizzou, the fourth team left that they have to play, Mizzou being probably the best of those four, Tennessee's in pretty good shape. Florida's going to really have to make some hay here to even have that game mean anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one possibility they talked about is November 19th. Both teams are in the tradition of the SEC, playing absolutely teams they have no business playing at that point of the season. Florida's scheduled to play Presbyterian and LSU scheduled to play South Alabama. There's been talk about buying them out of their games and making up the lost revenue for LSU missing a home game. Problem with that is LSU would be on a super short week going into their Thanksgiving game against Texas A&M. They don't want to play 3 straight SEC road games. A lot of issues with that. We've heard suggestions as much as, if it means something, we'll push our conference championship game back a week. There's no guarantee that the football commission is going to agree to wait to announce the 4 playoff teams an extra week. So there could be some issues with that, and we'll just have to see what happens. But I think Florida's got to worry about winning some games that are going to be very tough for them to win before that would even come into play. Or, of course, Tennessee would have to slip up somewhere where we expect them not to.
Yeah, that sums it up just about right, Rob. It's to me, it's a wait and react situation. If Florida goes out this week and loses to Missouri, that game probably won't be made up. You have to figure that 2 teams in the November 19th scenario, Presbyterian and South Alabama, both want their paychecks. They don't play that game for free. They want to get the money if they're going to take the beating that they're going to take. So I think to force those 2 out of a game is probably, and you even talked about the 3 consecutive road games for LSU. That scenario is improbable. I think the more likely thing is, unless Florida is able to go on a bit of a roll and show that this thing could end up in a situation where they can win it outright, it takes help too. It takes Tennessee to lose a game for Florida to win this thing outright. So we'll see. But I don't know. It's a shame because you want to see the game played, but I just don't know. If they can't find a date, I don't know that it's going to have any meaningful scenario. The result will have to be meaningful whatsoever. Better off not played, I guess.
Do you think there was any issue on the part of Florida's part, perhaps a little gamemanship? They didn't want to play the game on Saturday or Sunday of this week, and they saw that as a way out. I mean, all the other schools down there managed to play this weekend. Do you think there was any ill will on the part of Florida? I mean, I personally do, that they could have played this game this past weekend if they really wanted to.
I totally agree with that. I mean, other teams, like you say, found a way to get it done, especially the Florida teams. We know that the majority of the severe damage was done in North Carolina, but those teams were able to get their games in Saturday night, a couple in monsoons. But I think you're right, Rob. This game could have been played. Don't exactly know why it wasn't. And when you look at these 2 teams from a bowl game perspective, LSU needs 3 wins, to get to 6 and qualify for a bowl. Maybe they would have wanted it more than Florida, to tell you the truth. Florida's at 4-1. They need 2 to get to a bowl. But somewhere there could have been a compromise here, and this game could have been played. I don't have the reason why it wasn't, so you don't want to speculate. But I'm in the camp that you are, where I feel like it should have been played. It could have been played. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. Let's shift gears and get into some of the games that we have coming up in Week 7. We'll start with a battle in the ACC between NC State and Clemson. NC State, one of those teams that played in absolutely torrential rains on Saturday afternoon. They had a 12 noon kick, and if there wasn't a foot of rain during that game, and there was standing water all over the field, and a lightning delay, but they managed to get it in, and for the conditions, a score you'd expect, 10-3 over Notre Dame, with the only touchdown coming on a botched punt. Other than that, it was a couple of field goals, which was surprising. Either team could even get a field goal off in those conditions. Clemson coming off a 56-10 win over Boston College on Friday night, so they'll have an extra day of rest for this one. It's the home team. They're favored by about 18 points. Any chance of NC State pulling a big upset and making some waves in that division.
Yeah, well, NC State, Rob, at this point in time is a capable football team. There's no doubt about it. Head coach Doran has them playing very well. I think what they need more than anything is to be able to run the football. Tony Samuels and company, it's a good running football team. Clemson has shown to be a very solid defense throughout the season. The one game where they didn't play outstanding defense was, of course, against Louisville, and Louisville can pick apart any defense across the country, so there's no shame there. But for the Clemson Tigers, the run defense has given up about 133 a game. You have NC State averaging close to 200 on the ground. Their passing game with Ryan Finley is just not as effective if the running game isn't going. So it's a typical head coach Doran offense. We remember him from Northern Illinois, right? And they like to spread it out. It's sort of a run-oriented spread offense, and NC State right now has things going pretty well. So they're very capable. On the defensive side of the football for NC State, I think what's really surprising here, Rob, is their run defense has been stout, only allowing 91 yards per game. For the Clemson Tigers, the same can be said where they need their rushing attack to be potent in order to work the passing game off of that. So I think it comes down to how you feel NC State's going to perform on the defensive side of the football. The one thing that you really could look at here is the scheduling thus far to date. NC State has not really played a tremendous schedule. The list of opposition hasn't been good. William and Mary, East Carolina, Old Dominion. Wake Forest, a good defensive team, and NC State got out front and won that game rather easily. Last week's game played in the rain. Hard to judge. And obviously a win over Notre Dame is a good win for NC State. But in those conditions, a little bit difficult to judge. This is going to be their stiffest test to date, where Clemson's already been through a couple. I mean, they've been through difficult defenses this year in Auburn. Believe it or not, out of the Sun Belt, Troy has been a tremendous defensive unit so far this year. And also, of course, you know, they ripped right through the Louisville defense. So I think edge, opposition-wise, goes to Clemson. Whether or not they cover the big number, 16, 17, the power ratings were right in line with where this number is now, Rob. The power rating suggested that Clemson should be about a 17.5-point favorite. That's kind of where we see this game sitting right now, almost universally at 17.5. So maybe not a lot of value. There's been a push in the total from 56.5 up to 60.5. Perhaps that's due, at least in my mind, I think that's due to the fact that Clemson's offense has finally come around. We're adding Mike Williams to the receiving corps. Remember, Mike Williams lost the entire season last year, and he's their prime target on the offensive side, but it gives them 4 receivers to go to. They're just so loaded with weapons, and it's finally coming around for that offense. I think people probably see it that way, at least early in the week, that if NC State's going to win here, they're going to have to win by outscoring Clemson, and it's going to get up, in a higher scoring range. We'll see how it goes. But if Clemson was going to slump, if they were going to let down, it would have been last week. And, boy, we saw no letdown against the BC defense that entered that game number 1 in the country in total yards allowed. And it was just a complete slaughter from the get-go. So I think that's a pretty good indication that Clemson's rolling on all gears right now.
I agree. I think Clemson came out of the gate a little slow, and maybe that's a little bit of a hangover from losing the championship game the year prior, but they've definitely found their gear, and they look very hungry to get back to the college football playoffs. I think the number 17.5, 18, I don't see any value there either way. I think Clemson wins the game, whether they win by 17 or 24. I don't really have a feel for the spread. I don't see any value one way or the other at this point in time.
It's interesting. It's interesting, real quick, Rob, that there's a matchup between them and Florida State coming close for that Atlantic Division. Obviously, FSU looking forward to it, but in the case of FSU, and Clemson, they have bye weeks after these games. So in normal situations, you would look at games being played this week by Clemson as an 17.5-point favorite over NC State, and by Florida State as a large favorite, 3-touchdown against Wake Forest. You would look at those two games as letdown situations in preparation for the team on deck in the big showdown, Clemson and Florida State. But with the bye week, that angle goes out the window. So minus that, you could very well see a Clemson rout. But like I said before, NC State's proven to be very capable right now, and you don't want to sell them short.
Absolutely. Moving on to another team that probably won't be in a look-ahead spot, but they definitely have a huge game on tap with Texas A&M, and that's Alabama, as they travel to Tennessee. But I think it's kind of hard to look past Tennessee and the big rivalry that these two schools have. Bama obviously wasn't worried about looking ahead to Tennessee when they destroyed Arkansas 49-30. The defense looked phenomenal, and that game had a pick six for a touchdown. Tennessee, as you mentioned, coming off the disappointing Your Luck Has Run Out 45-38 loss to Texas A&M. I think that if Tennessee were to win this game, that would put to rest all talk of needing to make up the game between Florida and LSU. Tennessee, though, a pretty sizable home underdog, getting about 13 points at most shops at this point. Does Tennessee have it in them to pull the big upset and beat the number one team in the country, or is this going to be another strong showing from the Crimson Tide?
Yeah, boy, it's hard to bet against another strong showing by the Crimson Tide at this point in time, Rob. You know, the last few years, even though Alabama's been number one or near number one in the championship game, winning or losing or near the championship game, in recent history, the thing that always comes to mind with Alabama is that defensive unit. That's what we know them as. We know them as a rock-solid defensive unit. But the offense that they have now just makes them doubly dangerous. I mean, I was going through some numbers earlier in the week, and it's an Alabama team at this point in time that averages near 500 yards per game. We just don't remember Alabama ever having a 500-yard per game offense. To be exact, they're averaging 489.8, right in that 490 range. But the balance, 237 on the ground, 253 through the air. Lane Kiffin has done a tremendous job making this offense or bringing this offense into the new age from the prehistoric age where they were into the new age now. And they're just extremely difficult to handle at this point in time because they can beat you in a multitude of ways. That's Clemson in the championship game last year. Alabama needed to get into the mid-40s to win. They got into the mid-40s and won. So for Tennessee, a team that's come off of, if you just look at the series of games that Tennessee is off of at this point, huge divisional matchups with Florida and Georgia back-to-back, and then the overtime game that we talked about earlier with Texas A&M. So you played Florida, Georgia, A&M, and now Alabama. And you wonder how many times this team can get up and give you that complete focus, that 100% maximum effort. It's difficult at this point in time. They've suffered through some injuries. The team seems to be coming into their own offensively. But I don't know. To me, this just sets up extremely tough for them. They opened as a 10.5-point underdog. We've told everybody listening now that they're a 13-point underdog. So money has been in favor of Alabama in this game. I don't know that I could disagree. Just feel like Alabama's answered the bell at every call so far this year. When they've been faced with difficult opponents, they've come through with flying colors. And let's not forget that just last week, you and I talked about Arkansas as the 2-touchdown dog being the team or one of the teams, one of the few teams that's just not intimidated by Alabama physically. And Alabama goes out and scores 49 points in that game against Arkansas, win that game by near 3 touchdowns. So it's going to be tough for Tennessee. It's not to say they can't cover a number of this size, because certainly they could, but I just think it's going to be very tough. The home crowd's going to have to help out a lot here. Obviously, Alabama's not intimidated by Veno, but the Veno could help Tennessee. And if they get off to an early start, 14-0 lead or so, perhaps you've got an interesting contest at that point. But, boy, Bama's just so tough right now on both sides of the football.
Absolutely. Like I said, they made easy work of Arkansas in the game. We thought that Arkansas might not necessarily win, but might keep it close. That really wasn't even the case there. Let's keep it in the SEC, in another matchup between two top 25 programs in Ole Miss and Arkansas. Ole Miss stepped out of conference last week for a 48-21 win over Memphis, and Arkansas, as he mentioned, lost 49-30 to Alabama. The way I look at this game is this is Arkansas's true test. They're a 7.5-point underdog at home. They got a big win on the road against TCU. We're not really even sure if TCU's really that good. My guess is they're really not when you're beating Kansas 24-23 on a last-second field goal. But that was missed by Kansas. It wasn't even them kicking it. Kansas had a chance to win and missed the field goal. But nonetheless, if they could get a win against Ole Miss at home, I think the rest of the West would really start to view Arkansas in a much more favorable light. They debuted a lot more favorably nationally. Brett Bielema has been working very hard to get the program up and really get them to that Alabama, LSU, Ole Miss kind of level. And this is a kind of game where he has a chance to really help that program up to the next level. Do you think he can get it done?
Well, it's a different opponent, right? That's for sure. Although Mississippi is top 10 talent across the land, they just go about it a different way than does Alabama. Alabama can line up and physically whip a physical team, which they did last week, and Ole Miss doesn't necessarily line up and try and physically whip you. They're very good in their defensive front seven, so on that side of the football, it's going to be a challenge for the Arkansas offensive line. But from an offensive perspective, Ole Miss, much more of a finesse team, so to speak, much more of a pass-oriented team than maybe Alabama is. Alabama a little more balanced to their offense right now. Ole Miss, 158 on the ground per game, but 333 through the air behind Chad Kelly. So they're a little bit pass-oriented, which is different from Alabama. That being said, for Arkansas, I think what we saw last week was an awful lot put into that game against Alabama. We believe they could come within 14 last week and cover a point spread. That team believed they could go out there and win that game at home. They get a huge edge here this week in the fact that Ole Miss's defense is just not anywhere near as good overall as Alabama's. The back end of Mississippi's defense, that secondary, has been torched consistently this year. They're giving up 450 yards per game. So like I say, it's a team with top 10 talent, but it's a team that plays the game differently than does Alabama. So we'll see if Arkansas's physical nature can come closer in this one and even win this one outright. I'll say this. They're 0-2 in the division so far, Arkansas is. They've played, record-wise, the two best teams in their division so far. They played A&M. In that particular game, they were driving right down to the 2-yard line of A&M and then fumbled the football away, and the game just got out of control in the fourth quarter. They could have won that game last week, 19-point loss. Here's a spot where I think plus 7.5, perhaps they can make this game pretty close from an underdog perspective and maybe even win if the turnover situation goes their way. I just don't know for Arkansas if their secondary has been tested the way it's going to be tested this week by Ole Miss, and I'm not sure if the Arkansas pass rush is good enough to bother Chad Kelly in this game. Those two things considered, I wouldn't have thought if you told me ahead of time, Rob, that Alabama-Arkansas would end up totaling 79 points, 49-30. But in this game, we saw the total open up 68. It's since been bet down to about 67. We're going to see a high-scoring game here. Ole Miss is difficult to stop, and the way Arkansas, or the effectiveness that Arkansas has nowadays off of play-action passing, the fact that you have to respect their run game so much that usually in play-action guys are running wide open, I think they're going to have their way through the air against Ole Miss as well. We'll see a high-scoring game. I think that Arkansas has the opportunity here. Whether or not they can pull it off, another question. Hugh Freeze's team certainly doesn't want another loss. Another loss knocks them completely out of a New Year's Day bowl game. The two that they blew to start the season against Florida State, the 3-touchdown lead there, and then the 3-touchdown lead, and then the big lead against Alabama as well. They hurt, but they can still make it to New Year's Day with a big win here. So it's an interesting game. If I had my choice, I'd probably look toward the underdog here, plus the 7.5. I can see Arkansas performing pretty well in this game.
I'm kind of leaning in that direction at the moment as well. I think that whether or not Arkansas wins, I think it'll come down to turnovers, and if Chad Kelly can make enough big plays, or if the Arkansas defense can get a couple of stops when they need them. But I could definitely see this being a one-score game in either direction. Let's move on to a big Saturday night primetime game. Ohio State travels to Wisconsin. This will be Ohio State's toughest test, most likely, until they play Michigan on Thanksgiving weekend. Ohio State coming off a 38-17 win over Indiana. Wisconsin off of a much-needed bye week after a very tough 14-7 loss at Michigan. And I think the question in this game is going to come down to, is Wisconsin's defense good enough to stop the juggernaut that is the Ohio State offense, and will they be able to keep the game to a manageable score? What do you think, Rob?
Well, the good news for Wisconsin is they had the bye week in between, right? They lose a very tight game to Michigan, 14-7, a game in which they cover the number, certainly, right? But a game in which they were missing two of their starting linebackers, and Vince Beagle, there's probably not a more important person to a defense in the country than Beagle is to Wisconsin. And when they went into Michigan, when they played Michigan and were without those two linebackers, and with Alex Hornibrook, a redshirt freshman quarterback, against a Michigan defense, I really didn't think they had a chance to cover that number. And they performed pretty well. I mean, they held up. Michigan, for what it's worth, against physical football teams this year in LSU, we've seen how good that defense is and how physical they are on both sides of the football. And Michigan, an extremely physical football team. Boy, they've gone toe-to-toe. Now, Ohio State brings more of a speed element than perhaps those other two teams did, although I wouldn't say either LSU or Michigan is short on speed. Certainly they're not. Ohio State's just extremely fast. But Ohio State's still youthful. And despite the fact that they've gone through and won every game so far, and they've won some important games impressively, there's always a chance for a slip-up with a team like this. And it's always this type of team, methodical, strong defensively, that winds up being the one landmine in the entire field for a team seeking an undefeated season. I give Wisconsin that type of chance. I don't like the fact that Beagle's probably not going to play in this game. If they ever needed him, they need number 47 here. They won't have him. I don't believe they're going to have him. All indications are they won't. And it's hard to put the offensive burden on the young quarterback. I mean, Hornibrook is a calm, cool kid, but still It's just a difficult situation. Ohio State has turned out to be far better defensively, I think, than any of us thought they would be to start this season, considering the overhaul that they had on the defensive side. The young talent has come in, especially in the secondary, and been really good. I think what you look for here is probably a game that stays under the total, typical Wisconsin fashion. Don't believe Ohio State's going to get untracked. You know, they had a difficult time against Indiana last week. Now, you can look at it one of two ways. You can look at it and say perhaps it was an Ohio State letdown situation against Indiana. Maybe they didn't respect Indiana the way that they should have, but Indiana certainly has become a much better defensive team, and they gave Ohio State fits. J.T. Barrett did not throw the football well in that game. So that's something to look for here. If Wisconsin can rattle him and get him off target and maybe pick off a couple of passes, much the way Indiana had him off target last week and out of rhythm, then that's a good sign for Wisconsin. But I think more than anything, when you look at that game, I would just look at it from a totals perspective, play it under. This Wisconsin football team has shown me enough so far this season to let me know that they're not going to let anything get out of hand. And they're going to keep the score low, and they're going to make it a dogfight throughout. So that would probably be the way I lean. I'd probably lean towards the under in that game.
Rob, I'm kind of with you on that, leaning a little bit towards Wisconsin and the points. I think that they are a team that has obviously proven they can play with some of the better teams in college football, LSU, and they got the win at Michigan State, although Michigan State's now really fallen off a little bit. And then they played Michigan very, very tough on the road, and I think now they get a great spot. They're at home. They're off of a bye week, and I just don't think that they're going to let the game get away from them. The question I asked at the beginning was, do you think that Wisconsin's defense can do enough to keep them in the game? I think the answer is yes. I don't think they're going to let Ohio State run all over them by any stretch of the imagination. I think they're going to be able to do enough offensively on their own to manage to stay in it. Whether or not they can pull the upset, I don't want to rule it out. I mean, we've seen home teams in this kind of spot pull the big upset and get the victory. I think Ohio State will be okay to win the game, but if they make one or two mistakes and let that Wisconsin defense win the game for them, could be a different outcome in that one. I think it's going to be a very good game on Saturday night.
Hey, Rob, one more point here. Let's just look at this from this perspective. Ohio State's going to play the Wisconsin defense, which has proven to be one of your top defenses in the country so far. Take a look at the defenses Ohio State's played against this year. Bowling Green, it's a sieve. Tulsa, it's a sieve. Oklahoma, another sieve. Rutgers, you don't even have to say the word sieve. And
they don't have a defense.
Right. And then Indiana. Those are the 5 defenses that this team has played so far this year. And when I talked about the youth going on the road here, you mentioned the fact that it's a night game. The venue in Madison, there's probably not a crazier venue in the country, especially in a nationally telecasted night game. And I just have the feeling that these young kids for Ohio State, especially on the offensive side, I don't want to say they're going to be in awe of the venue, but if things start to go a little bit sideways for a team like that, you can see them losing control. And what we saw last week against Indiana from the offense proves that Ohio State can be taken out of their game. So this is by far the stiffest defense Ohio State has seen this year. We'll see how they react. We'll see if J.T. Barrett handles it well. But I would certainly put Wisconsin in this contest. Just for the listeners here, the total opened at 48. It's down to 44, 44.5 in a couple of places, and the number has stuck at Ohio State minus 10 straight across. Ohio State is not Alabama at this point. We talked about Alabama going on the road and against Tennessee, and, you know, Alabama's done a lot of damage to good teams so far this season. I don't believe Ohio State is quite Alabama yet, and this is going to be a real test for OSU. I think that Wisconsin can make this a real game, low-scoring dogfight the way they like it.
Rob, I agree. If I were to open up a newspaper on Sunday morning, if I don't watch the game Saturday, which of course I'll be watching the game Saturday, but if I were to open up and look at the sport page headline on Sunday morning, I would be a lot more surprised to see Bama loses at Tennessee as a headline than Ohio State falls to Wisconsin.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Rob. No doubt about it. And we'll see. Like I said, a lot's going to ride on Alex Hornibrook. He's got to be able to get a couple of drives against that Ohio State defense and help their own defense out. One more time, I wish Vince Beagle was involved here. I think that would be a complete seller for me on the Wisconsin side. Still think I might get there with Wisconsin, however.
Well, Rob, that does it for the key games that we had identified for the weekend. But I think we each have a make or break game for the weekend. I'll start, and I'm going to head to the ACC, where we've got UNC coming off an embarrassing loss to Virginia Tech on Saturday at home, no less, 34-3. And then you've got them traveling to play Miami, coming off the very tough 20-19 loss to Florida State. This is kind of like a losers out game in terms of the chance to play for the ACC title. Can UNC recover from their embarrassing loss and give Miami a game, or is Miami just too strong of a team to lose a game like this?
Well, if we just use comparative scores, we know that North Carolina beat Florida State, and we know that Miami didn't beat Florida State. Now, both games, we don't use comparative scores as
vastly different games. Yes.
Right, as a general handicapping rule, right? But they're 1- and 2-point games that could have gone either way in both situations. So we know the teams are competitive. I don't think that we can take North Carolina's loss last week with any seriousness. This is an offense under Larry Fedora that needs better conditions. They just can't play in the type of conditions, the monsoon-type conditions that they played in last week against Virginia Tech. They're not built for it. They're not good enough defensively to hold up in that type of thing. They're a team that, for lack of a better term, they need to get to 40 to beat you. And you just weren't going to do it last week in those conditions. So for Mitch Trubisky, Ryan Switzer, Bug Howard. Remember, they didn't even have Elijah Hood in that game. If Elijah Hood would have been available to UNC, perhaps they could have pounded on the ground a little better. I'm going to take that loss with a grain of salt. From the North Carolina side, if we were talking about Virginia Tech, I'd be giving you a different little summary here. But from the North Carolina side, I would look at it that way. The Coastal Division, right now Virginia Tech's on top, undefeated, 2-0. But Carolina and Miami both have one loss. And I don't think a two-loss team is going to win that division and get themselves to the ACC championship game. So like you said, it is a make-or-break deal. North Carolina's come through in a lot of situations. Miami, I commented earlier in the show about how disappointing it was that they allowed 407 total yards to Florida State. It's a defense that had really been propped up by the media, and rightfully so, through their first 4 or 5 games up until last week where they just didn't play that well. The Florida State offense, obviously explosive, but North Carolina is as explosive as any team in the country. It's going to be on Brad Kaya and this offense because North Carolina has shown us they'll give up points. I think the points might be a little bit too heavy in this game. I think last look, Miami was a 7-point favorite in this game over North Carolina. Probably not sure that that's a good number here. Although I like the Miami squad, I think that North Carolina is a team that, they score on anybody. The total here opened up at 60. It's up to 64.5. You might see some sort of shootout, like you see in most North Carolina games when the weather conditions are right. You might see that same type of thing here because Kaya and the running game should have their chances against North Carolina. Everybody else so far this year has. And for North Carolina, like I say, on a dry field, they'll score at anybody. So big game. I think in the end, Miami could squeak it out. But if you're going to give me 7, and in some cases, as I look now, 7.5 points, I think I'd probably lean towards UNC plus the points. Over looks like a real good way to go, though, because North Carolina just gets tied up in these high-scoring affairs. That's the way they want it. And I don't know that Miami will be afraid to play it that way. Mark Richt likes to keep the game a little closer to the vest, but he's got weaponry that can take advantage of what UNC has on defense, no doubt about it.
Absolutely. I think it will be a great game on Saturday. And, Rob, I believe you have a make-or-break game to close us out here on this Week 7 early look. What do you got for us?
Well, I'm taking a look at the Pac-12 game between Washington State and UCLA, Rob. UCLA loses last week as a favorite on the road, and, boy, they were high-priced. They opened up 7.5 against Arizona State, pushed all the way to 10, and then go to ASU. Can't do anything offensively. The first team Arizona State's played this season that hasn't been able to do anything offensively, and they lose straight up. And that puts them in a situation now where they have 2 losses in the Pac-12 South. The Pac-12 South, much like the Atlantic Coast Conference Coastal, really wide open and competitive. I mean, you can put these teams in the blender, hit the button, and, a different team would come up as the winner every single time. Arizona State, Utah, Colorado. My personal preference right now at this point is Colorado to win that division. But UCLA with 2 losses, the leaders only have 1, and get themselves right back into this thing by going on a little bit of a winning streak. But if they fall to 1-3 in conference, they're done. And Jim Mora's team had huge expectations coming into this season. There's no doubt about it. A lot of people picked them to win the Pac-12 this year. Others liked Washington, but from the South side, almost universally, they liked UCLA. Big game for them. Washington State, on the other hand, ever since Mike Leach went crazy and called his team soft, they've been performing up to preseason expectations. They finished last season strong. They are now rolling. We've seen that Oregon is certainly not the Oregon of even last year at this point in time. So the victory over Oregon by Washington State may mean a little less at this point in time. But Washington State came back with another big win last week, and now they sit atop of that Pac-12 North with Washington. Washington 3-0, Washington State 2-0. And if they can keep a clean slate here, that Apple Cup is going to be for all the marbles. So I think it's a real important game for both sides. Can Washington State continue on and win games and keep their mark unblemished inside the Pac-12? Big question. Obviously, Luke Falk in the offense you have to love, but the defensive side of the football, at times they're good, and at times they're not very good. There's an inconsistency to that defensive football team. So we'll see how this one goes, but like I said, I really figure this is a make-or-break game. If Washington State loses, you have to run the table and then beat Washington at the end of the year. That's going to be difficult. But if they win here, if they want to win that division, let's put it this way, they have to win this game, next week's game. Every game's almost going to be a make-or-break for them as far as the Pac-12 championship or the hope of a Pac-12 championship appearance is concerned. For UCLA, it's definitely do or die here. So we'll see how it goes. Washington State has rarely been in these types of situations, but it's a veteran club. Probably handle it okay. We'll see how this one goes. I think it's a very, very interesting game that people should pay attention to. They did kick Logan Tago, one of their best linebackers, off the team this week due to off-the-field problems. That doesn't help their defense anymore.
No, that could definitely end up being an issue. You're talking about a late kick, 10:30. Washington State right now about a 7-point favorite, I believe, and that's up from where it opened. It opened as low as 3, and it is all the way up to as high as 7 now. So quite a big move in that spread.
Yeah, and all of a sudden, the love affair for UCLA is gone. I'll say this. When you go to Pullman, the last couple of years, now that Mike Leach has had a defense that I could at least refer to as inconsistent a couple minutes ago, before we couldn't even, in prior years, we couldn't even refer to this defense as inconsistent. When you go to Pullman and play them, and they play that sellout blitz style, they seem to be able to hit the quarterback a lot better when they're at home. The home crowd gets them cranked. They like being in that stadium. Josh Rosen may take some real hits in this game. He's actually injured coming into this one, so that's a problem for UCLA. Jim Mora, Jr., in an interesting quote earlier this season, had said that, or not earlier this season, earlier this week, we're out here on Wednesday, this quote came out maybe about Monday morning, where he said, we're just not a very good football team right now, and Josh is taking way too many hits. Against a defense like this that likes to sell out and go after the quarterback, it could be tough for Rosen. Right now he's listed as questionable. I'd assume he's going to play, but if he does, I still worry about him a little bit against this style of defense. This could be a tough night for UCLA. This is a venue that even when Washington State wasn't a good football team, has caused trouble for a lot of Pac-12 teams.
Yeah, Rob, I think it will be a good game late on a Saturday to wrap up a great Week 7 of college football. Speaking of wrapping it up, that's going to do it for us this week. Any final words for our listeners?
Yeah, not too much this week, Rob. I will say this. As we head into the back half of the season, Rob, it's kind of nice to sit back and just reassess the coaching changes that took place at the start of the season and what we thought might happen to teams who changed coaches and staff this year. I think a lot of credit needs to go to Justin Fuente in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech. Right now, as we talked about earlier, a team that's 2-0 in the division or in the conference, leading that Coastal Division with a quarterback in Gerard Evans who came came to the program from the JC level and is now really beginning to execute that offense much better than he did earlier this season. The loss to Tennessee earlier this year, the 45-24 game played at Bristol Motor Speedway where they were up 14-0, I think is the only real game where, we saw things slip away from them, not for an entire 60 minutes, but maybe for a 20-minute period where Tennessee just got the best of them. So this is a team, I think, that their coaching situation, really, it's a team on the rise again. They retain Bud Foster. The defense is still good. So I would be on the lookout for Virginia Tech the rest of the way. I think as these weeks go on, team's only going to get better. They're getting more used to the system on the offensive side of the football. So keep an eye on Virginia Tech. I think that this is a team who's really making the most of the coaching change this year.
Well, Rob, another good early look for Week 7 in the books. We will be back again next week as we take a look at Week 8 and recap everything we saw in Week 7. And, of course, I'll leave you with the reminder, don't forget to get over to robvenosports.com in addition to all of the selections for the weekend from myself, Derek, and, of course, Rob Veno. Lots of great information for you if you're doing your own handicapping, Rob's power lines and all kinds of statistics and great weather information, tons of good stuff to look over. Be sure to get to robvenosports.com and be sure to listen to us again next week for our Week 8 early look. For Rob Veno, I'm Rob O'Connor. We'll see you next week.